As the trade relationship with the United States enters one of its most uncertain phases in years, Ottawa is moving quickly to open a new economic door in South America. A major free trade agreement between Canada and Mercosur, the bloc led by Brazil and Argentina, may be closer than it appeared. And if it is concluded, this agreement will not be just another trade headline. It could become part of a much larger strategic shift. Canada's attempt to reduce its dependence on Washington at a time of tariffs, uncertainty, and possible turbulence surrounding the CUSMA review. According to Reuters, Canada and Mercosur are moving closer to an agreement that could be concluded as early as 2026. New talks were expected in Brasilia, and sources linked to the governments of Canada, Argentina, and Brazil indicated that the deal could be finalized by September or October. Canada is trying to reduce its vulnerability in a world that is becoming more unstable, more protectionist, and less predictable. For decades, the Canadian economy was built around one simple reality: privileged access to the United States market. That relationship will remain essential. The United States is still, by far, Canada's most important trading partner. But the past few years have made one lesson very clear: depending too heavily on a single market is a risk. And that risk is growing. The trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico came into force on July 1st, 2020. Now, the agreement is approaching its mandatory review, scheduled for July 2026. The Canadian government has already created a new advisory committee to deal with this economic relationship with the United States, precisely because the review is approaching in an environment of intense trade tension. The committee will be led by Minister Dominic LeBlanc and will be tasked with helping the Canadian government navigate the CUSMA review amid American tariffs and uncertainty about the future of the trade relationship with Washington. In recent years, the United States has used tariffs as a political tool. Canadian sectors, such as steel, aluminum, automobiles, lumber, and industrial products, have already felt the impact. And in a scenario where Washington signals that tariffs may continue to be used as a pressure tactic, Ottawa needs to think beyond the southern border. This is where Mercosur becomes relevant. Mercosur represents a large-scale market in South America. For Canada, an agreement with the bloc would open opportunities in areas such as automobiles, auto parts, industrial machinery, technology, chemicals, plastics, mining, energy, services, and investment. For Mercosur countries, the agreement would mean greater access to a developed, stable economy that is rich in capital and integrated into global value chains. The negotiations between Canada and Mercosur did not begin now. They were launched in 2018, but remained largely stalled for years. What changed was the international context. The pandemic exposed weaknesses in supply chains. The war in Ukraine increased concerns over energy, food, and strategic minerals. The rivalry between the United States and China intensified, and protectionism returned to the center of global trade policy. In this new environment, trade agreements have stopped being merely economic instruments. They have become instruments of national security, food security, energy security, and geopolitical influence. And Canada is not the only one to realize this. The European Union recently reached a political agreement with Mercosur after more than 2 decades of negotiations. On December 6, 2024, the European Union and the 4 founding members of Mercosur, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, announced a new agreement in principle on the trade pillar of a broader partnership. The European Parliament notes that this process had been under negotiation for years and that the new agreement marked an important breakthrough after a long period of deadlock. The European Commission was even clearer in explaining the logic behind the agreement: to diversify and protect supply chains, expand sources of energy and raw materials, increase trade, and create new opportunities for companies on both sides. This is essential information for Canadians. Europe did not reach an agreement with Mercosur out of diplomatic romanticism. It did so because it understood that South America is becoming more important in a fragmented world. The region has food, energy, critical minerals, consumer markets, industrial capacity, and strategic positioning. In a world where supply chains can be disrupted by wars, tariffs, political disputes, or logistical crises, diversifying suppliers is no longer optional. It has become a priority. Canada is looking at the same map. If the European Union, with 27 countries and one of the largest economies in the world, sees strategic value in moving closer to Mercosur, Canada cannot ignore that direction. But there is one important difference. Europe has already moved forward. Canada is still negotiating. That makes this moment even more urgent. A Canada-Mercosur agreement could give Canadian companies greater access to South American markets and reduce tariff barriers that currently make Canadian products less competitive. It could also help Canada expand its presence in a region where other major players, especially China and the European Union, are already making moves. Brazil, in particular, is a central piece on this chessboard. It is the largest economy in South America, a member of the G20, a major producer of food, energy, and minerals, and a country with growing influence in international forums. For Canada, a deeper relationship with Brazil would not be only commercial, it would also be diplomatic and strategic. Argentina, for its part, is important in energy, agriculture, mining, and lithium. Paraguay and Uruguay offer relative stability, agricultural production, energy, and regional access. Together, these countries form a platform that could connect Canada to one of the most important regions in the Western Hemisphere. But this agreement must be analyzed seriously. Free trade is not a magic formula. Trade agreements create opportunities, but they also create pressures. Sensitive Canadian sectors may be concerned about competition. Farmers may question imports. Unions may demand labor protections. Environmentalists may call for clear commitments against deforestation and environmental degradation, especially because any agreement with South America inevitably raises debates about the Amazon, agriculture, and land use. These concerns should not be ignored. A good agreement needs to open markets, but it also needs to protect standards. It needs to promote growth, but it cannot sacrifice workers. It needs to facilitate investment, but it must maintain environmental commitments. It needs to be economically ambitious and politically sustainable. That will be the challenge for Ottawa. The Canadian government needs to show that trade diversification does not simply mean signing any agreement available. It means building partnerships that strengthen the Canadian economy in the long term, and this is where an agreement with Mercosur could fit into a broader strategy. Canada already has important agreements with the European Union, with countries in the Asia-Pacific region, and with traditional partners. But South America is still a region where Canada could do much more. The Canadian presence in mining, energy, finance, education, clean technology, and infrastructure already exists, but it could be expanded with clearer trade rules. For Canadian companies, predictability is essential. A trade agreement reduces uncertainty. It establishes rules. It defines mechanisms to resolve disputes. It lowers tariffs. It makes it easier to plan investments, hire workers, and expand operations. Without an agreement, each sector remains more exposed to barriers, political decisions, and tariffs. With an agreement, the risks do not disappear, but they can be managed within a clearer legal framework. That is the same principle that made CUSMA so important for Canada. The problem is that Canada now needs to prepare for a scenario in which CUSMA may no longer offer the same stability it once did. The United States is becoming more protectionist. China is becoming more assertive. Europe is looking for new suppliers. Middle powers are trying to reduce dependencies. Supply chains are being redesigned, and regions that were once treated as secondary are becoming central to food, energy, minerals, and economic security. In this scenario, Mercosur is not just another trade bloc. It is an opportunity for Canada to expand its room for maneuver. The question, therefore, is not whether Mercosur will replace the United States. It will not. The real question is, does Canada want to continue depending almost entirely on a single partner in an increasingly unstable world? The answer should be no. An agreement with Mercosur will not solve every problem, but it could become an important piece of a broader diversification strategy. The European Union has already understood this. Mercosur has understood it as well. Now, Canada appears to be trying to accelerate its own steps. If the agreement is concluded in 2026, it could mark a new chapter in Canadian trade policy, a chapter in which Ottawa protects its relationship with Washington, but also builds real alternatives in other regions of the world.